I call Jonah Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it would certainly be great if we didn't need legislation like this, but we are passing this legislation because it's very much needed within our society. And for those people who would think that we don't need legislation like this, I would say they need to get out of the little bubble that perhaps they might live in and get into the real world, because this is absolutely... So what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker, is talk about part two of this bill, because it's incredibly important. And essentially what is happening in part two of this legislation is modernising and getting these various acts up to date to ensure that they cover what's required in a modern society. When I was at high school, if you wanted to, not that I wanted to, but if somebody chose to harass somebody by taking an inappropriate photograph of them, they probably would have needed to have remembered to take their camera with them, then go down to the shop, get the photo developed, and actually print it off, and then send it around to get multiple copies and photocopy it and send it. It would have taken probably at least 5 days to get a turnaround on it. So things went so flash in the 1980s, it took a little bit of time for things to happen. And so we do need to modernise these acts to ensure that we are covering what is going on, because the effects of cyberbullying in particular are absolutely just devastating for particularly young people within our society. So if you look back to look at some of the research that's been done on this, and there was a report done by Victoria University, which I'm sure has been talked about as we've gone through this act, but there's Dr. Vanessa Green, who was head of Victoria's School of Educational Psychology and Pedagogy, along with a team of postgraduate students, did some study, and there was an interesting quote from her, and I'll read it out for you because I think it's pertinent to these particular parts in part two. And she said, "The internet has made bullying a more complex issue than it was 20 years ago, and as a result it requires a more sophisticated response. The old methods may not be as effective as they were. We need to be thinking in a more creative way about how to address bullying." And so that's why we do need to ensure that, for example, that in these acts, particularly say in the crimes, not the Crimes Act, the Harassment Act, the insertion of the word electronic communication is in there, because in 1997, which to most of us seems not that long ago, no one thought of using electronic communication clearly as a form of harassment, and so we need to insert those words there. We need to insert in the Human Rights Act from 1993, after radio or television, include or other electronic communication, because this is so much a part of our society now. Now, I just heard the previous speaker getting a little bit perhaps distracted, but nevertheless talked about the fact that actually this is not the way for us to handle it. That in fact the way to deal with this kind of bullying is to get better education, to do mediation, to get groups to do it. And actually that will be quite effective. In my time as a school guidance counsellor, that was incredibly effective in terms of getting peer groups in, working with them, looking at those particular issues. But I think what we need to make sure that we understand is that this act does not preclude those kinds of interventions from occurring. Simply because we're making it against the law to bully people online does not mean that we're saying that other forms of intervention are not possible. And in looking at the functions and powers of the approved agency, it has powers to investigate complaints. It has, under 8C, the ability to use advice, negotiation, mediation and persuasion as appropriate to resolve complaints. And so that is contained within the law. That will be a part of the law, that agency will be empowered to use all of those interventions that are available in the toolbox. But what we are making sure that we're doing is not necessarily elevating everything, which is the only option at the moment, to a full-blown sort of law, sort of legal process through the district courts or otherwise. I think it's important that we continue to move forward on this. It's important, as I say, coming back to part 2, that these particular acts, the Privacy Act, Mr. Chair, I think that probably covers it all, the Privacy Act and all those.
Unless you get the call, you can't continue talking. I'm calling David Seymour.
Mr.